Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. Good to have you along again. We are going to spend one more session before we head back into our study of John. Where are we, Mike? About John 6-ish, 7-ish, somewhere in there. I forget exactly where we left off, but we're going to spend one more session on Q&A. You've sent in wonderful questions, and if you have questions, again, here's our address, questions.dcwp@gmail.com. One more thing before we jump in is with the expanded edition of Mike's book that came out from Lexham Press just this last month, one of the reasons to buy it is, and I know there's a lot there that's also in the first book, but there's a lot of new stuff too, and is the use of the bibliography in the back. Let me just say a comment about that. I mean, Mike had worked, I think he even hired someone at one point. Were you involved in this, Mike, in the creation of a bibliography for DCW work in general? I mean, it's hundreds, if probably more than, are we talking thousands, of entries into a bibliography that he did not have time to even compile based on his prodigious schedule. So I remember this is a while back, he was working on a bibliography. Why? Because, as Mike would often say, he's not inventing material. He's simply connecting dots. And that is so important for a person to understand on an entry level to a DCW discussion is we're not inventing material. We're trying to gather what the church has been saying really for centuries, but especially from authors that now you may not have read before. You know, again, the Jewish-Christian dialogues that have been happening just in this last generation, as well as ancient Near Eastern stuff that is still being found now. Again, archaeology, biblical archaeology is a science that's 150 years old. I mean, we are still discovering things today about linguistics and textual matters that not even our grandfathers knew about. So the point is that when Paul, and as you look at the end of his expanded edition, one thing, well, yeah, I'll let you say this. I'm sure you're going to say it, Mike. Your reading list now has taken, it's gone from days to years now of what you need to be reading, and so do I. I would say one other thing that is sometimes misunderstood, when Mike puts a book in his bibliography or an article or a dictionary entry, it's not because that person agreed with him or that it's a DCW promoting idea or book or author. Some of these names here I remember very well. He copied me, or he sent me a copy of a email exchange that he had with that person, Larry Hurtado, here on page 499. I'm looking at his 4 entries. Mike had an extensive email discussion with Larry Hurtado before he passed. Dr. Hurtado passed away as well recently. And it was, again, so beautiful that I wish everyone could be a fly on the wall for these kind of discussions. It's two men who respected each other, differed clearly on some issues dealing with Jesus, Trinitarianism, ancient Near Eastern patterns of worship, whatever. But yet these exchanges are on the highest level of courteousness and kindness and respect, and yet clearly distinguishing their views from each other and asking, well, what do you do about this? What do you do about that? And so realize that when you read an entry or see a name, it does not mean this is a DCW person. Understand, you are dealing with a lot of people you need to read, but you may not be listening to someone who necessarily agrees with Mike on every matter. There's certainly differences of opinion in this bibliography. I see them just by names and books, but they are necessary to here we go, that idea of how do I study the DCW? Well, I study everything around the DCW, and Mike's bibliography is worth the price of admission. So,
yeah. If anything, is also like you'll learn, like just from the bibliography itself, you'll learn that. I think one of the accusations that often are lobbied at Mike was he made this all up in his mind. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, once you even just cursorily look at the bibliography, you'll realize there's a whole bunch of scholarship that is Christian, non-Christian, that has dealt with the supernatural unseen realm. That this is not something that he was making up. He was consolidating, if not synthesizing the information into a way that was understandable to a layperson. And I just discovered, just even looking at this again, I had no idea. Mike actually had an entry in the Dictionary of the Old Testament Prophets book.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Pages 162 to 66 about the divine council. So like they even tagged him, hey, can you write up an article that will be included in this dictionary that will be read by other scholars, other pastors, other folks who need to understand the Old Testament and the world it was in. Can you write this up? Like, my gosh, the kind of influence that Mike had in really undanked or unacknowledged ways.
Yep. I was in a class in Dallas Seminary in 1988. I still have the syllabus, and it has DCW material in there. There was part of the discussion of the whole semester was on the Divine Council. So again, this has been around for a while. It was, again, part of a class at Dallas Seminary when I was there. So that predates Mike's work by 20 years. But the point is that Mike brought it to an evangelical world that had not seen this stuff surfaced. So, yeah, it's been around. And the idea that Mike invented, yeah, we got to get that out of our head. All right, let's jump into our questions. We'll handle 5 today. And one of them I'm going to handle kind of hurriedly because we will be talking about it in our study of John. The first question, interesting question, a good one. How is kosmos used? The Greek word kosmos, you've heard of that term, means world, and I should back off. It doesn't mean world. This is commonly a problem of translation. When a Greek writer uses a word, he's not thinking about how it's going to get used in 2,000 years, right? So he doesn't mean, hey, think world. It's a word that finally comes into our language as translated, glossed as world, right? Here's the question, is it possible that it could at times refer to the Gentile world or the place where unclean peoples reside as opposed to Jews who consider themselves the holy ones? This seems to work in passages like John 1:29. Now, what I'm going to do is quickly answer with if I was in the classroom, I'd kind of walk toward the person with the hand up and I'd say, thank you for thinking ahead of me and giving me today's lecture, because that's kind of where I was going, right? So we've done this in John. Here it is, John 1:29. The next day John saw Jesus. Behold, the Lamb of God who? And a lot of people and a lot of commentators, jump on that Lamb of God as though that's the theme. Well, really, the sin of the world, I think, is what caught the reader. Because we've had the Lamb of, the lambs taking away Jewish sins ever since Leviticus 17. That's what the goats and lambs do. What shocked the reader was, here's a lamb doing the work on outside people, the sin of the world. Okay, so I like that the reader caught that, or the questioner caught that. Let's add to that, and I'm going to stay in John pretty much, how this would work then again in the mind of the original author and reader. The most famous passage in the Bible, for God so loved the cosmos. Think of how that would have fallen on Nicodemus's ears, a good Jew who knew that God loved the Jew, but had never heard it in this way. God loved the world, the cosmos, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever, you don't have to be Jewish now, whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Notice the next verse. Again, when we were talking about it in John 3, I emphasized this is probably the second most famous verse, I think, in value theologically to the Bible, beyond the first one, John 3:16. For God did not send his Son, the Messiah, into the cosmos to do the very thing that you thought he would do to the cosmos, and that is condemn it. That's what the Old Testament kind of promised, that the Messiah would, end Gentile rule, but that the world through him might be saved. So I think the use of the word cosmos 3 times in John 3:16 and 17 has exactly what the listener is catching here, is a sense of not just people, but Gentile people. And that the very thing that a Messiah came in the Pharisaic mind to do, he is not going to do. He's going to do the opposite. He's going to save the cosmos, save the Gentiles, which of course includes Jews, but I'm just saying that it has a Gentile flavor in how that word is being used. We saw this in John 4. Remember when the people came back, the Samaritan people, beyond the woman, started talking to Jesus, and many of them believed. It says at the end, now we know that you are indeed the Christ, the Messiah, the Savior of, and I think this would have caught the reader's mind, the cosmos. He is the Savior of Samaritans, Jews, and everything in between. John 6. I give and we'll talk about this later, eating his flesh and drinking his blood. But there it is again at the end of 651, which I shall give for the life of the world. That you just never would have thought that the Messiah would be all about saving non-Jews if you're coming straight out of the Old Testament. He himself, 1 John 2:2, he himself is the propitiation for our sins. There's the Jew. He's fulfilling the story of what Old Testament sacrifices were setting out to do. Propitiation, I don't like that word because it comes from Latin more than Greek, but he is the source of mercy for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the whole world. There's that Gentile flavor that comes at the end of 1 John 2:2. Now, 2 verses to say, well, is there any hint in the Old Testament that the word for kosmos, which would have been gay, or what's the Old Testament word for earth? Well, I'm forgetting.
Terra.
Yeah, that would be the land. Yeah. Well, whatever it is, I'm forgetting right now. But you know, the idea of the whole earth is there anything about this Gentileness flavor of the word earth? Yeah, I think it comes mostly, well, I'm just going to give 2 verses, and it's end of Isaiah, very strong, second half of Isaiah, very strong on the Gentiles coming to Yahweh, that theme of the Gentiles coming. There still is that idea they're coming to Jerusalem, so they're still going to be, giving prostration, as it were, to the Jewish nation. But at least it gives the hint that there's some kind of a cosmic, shall we say, earth-wide rendition of coming to Yahweh. Look to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth. There's that plea to the entire world. For I am God, there is no other. I have sworn by myself, the word has gone out of my mouth. This is 45:22. Mm-hmm. And shall not return, that to me every knee shall bow. There's at least that, again, pattern of something worldwide, cosmic about the coming to Yahweh. And one more verse. This verse, I think, is fascinating because it's thought of by Paul as his missionary call. I think every Christian today can apply this verse to themselves, and Jesus applies it to himself. So here's where we and Jesus, I and Jesus are, and Paul, shall we say, are on the same team, and we're all taking this passage to be something that we can apply it to our life. Indeed, this is Isaiah 49:6. Is it too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel? Implied yes. But notice what happens. I will also give you as a light to the Goyim, the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of, and here it is, the cosmos in Septuagint. You're going to the entire cosmos that includes the Gentiles. So I love the question. It's catching a point that I think needs to be stressed, that cosmos, yes, means world, but it sometimes has the flavor of Gentileness to it that I think would have shocked the first audience of the gospel. So.
Would it be fair to say that in some sense, in those passages and instances, that the word cosmos is, I like the way that you said flavor, so that it's almost like, don't just think that's only Gentile. It is including the Jew, but it's more of a background note versus the primary note that you're supposed to taste and to notice is it's talking about also all the other ethnicities, all the other peoples.
Yes, yeah.
That it's
if you're not
included.
Jewish, you're Gentile. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and so like because what's interesting is there is, for example, when you go to BDAG, the standard New Testament Greek dictionary, the passage for this one in John 1, it appears later in the 6th entry for the word cosmos, humanity in general, the world. But what I took notice was that there is also a reference as part of their evidence that James, who was probably writing to his more high majority Jewish Christian church, in James 2 verse 5, listen, my dear brothers and sisters, has God not chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised those who love him? Right? So like it's not, in this case, in James's mindset, it's not a division between Jew and Gentile. It's a division between those who have a lot of money and those who do not. And that even that division, no, all included in the world, and all in the faith. And so I think that it's a good question. It's a thoughtful question. I think we just have to be cautious to not give off the impression to folks that, well, Jesus only came to take care of the Gentiles. It's like, no, he Paul's gospel was to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. That like we get included in, like, which is awesome. Like, so
there's a tree into which we're grafted. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and so it's not an either or. He's trying to bring completion to the whole thing, all of humanity back.
There's a book called, again, who wrote it? Yuck. Oh, man. Why did I even bring it up? But if I can't remember Joachim Jeremias. Is that how you say it? Yeah, Jeremias is how it's spelled. And Joachim, his first name. And, it's a small little book about the gospel to the Gentiles. I forget the name of the book, so why am I bringing it up? But look up Jeremias' books, and one of them is on latter Isaiah and how the Gentiles will come to Yahweh through the work of the Messiah. It's a wonderful book. It's old. I mean, it's back in the 50s, 60s, but it's very paradigmatic for how I think of how the gospel works. This second question we're going to take pretty quickly because you can tell by the question, we are getting there in our study of John in the podcast. I realize you will get to this later in John, but when Jesus quotes Psalm 82 in John 10:34-36, it sounds to me like he's talking about human judges and not divine beings. How does a DCW keep a supernatural reading of Psalm 82? This is not lost on people who, again, think about DCW issues and then know the book or, know the Bible well, is that Jesus, one of the texts in John is where Jesus actually refers back to Psalm 82. I'm going to keep my answer short for time, Mike, because we will get to this. And I think this is a good reason, by the way, to buy, if you have not yet purchased Unseen Realm, get the expanded edition now that it's out. And Mike deals with this extensively. I deal with it in my dissertation basically as a footnote because my readers at Dallas Seminary said you have to deal with John 10. If you're going to talk about Psalm 82, well, here you have Jesus quoting the Psalm, so you at least have to spend a footnote. And I remember spending a whole day at our theological library in town coming up with one paragraph to settle my understanding of Psalm 82. So I'm just going to read this and then we'll be on, but here it is. Jesus' point in John 10 is not to demote the Elohim of Psalm 82 to mortals, but to argue what I would call from greater to the lesser. Here's his argument, if even other divine beings could bear the title Elohim, which they do under Yahweh's authority, without blasphemy, how much more may the one whom the Father, quote, sanctified and sent into the world, claim to be the Son of God? So the argument is, hey, I'm even better than that. I'm sanctified and sent. They weren't sanctified and sent like I am. So quick answer would be that Jesus' argument assumed a genuine plurality of divine beings, sons of God they're called, subordinate to Yahweh. And here's the point. We have no evidence that Jewish interpretation of Psalm 82 ever took these beings to be human judges. Jews themselves, I believe, from all of our Targums and anything we have Jewish materials outside of our canon, New Testament, never take these to be human. Otherwise, Jesus' logic would make no sense. He'd be saying, humans can be called human judges, so I can be divine. Well, that doesn't make any logical sense. So to me, the argument that they're human judges falls flat pretty much right away if you take it seriously. I'm ready to move on. If you are, Mike, anything you want to add? But we'll talk about this, of course, in John 10.
I would definitely recommend, if folks are curious, where does the expanded edition talk about this more in depth? It's in chapter 4, as under the title Jesus and the Divine Council. It's a really shortened version of Dr. Heiser's paper, actually, on John 10 and Psalm 82. I read that. It's a really good work of exegetical processing of, if you're taking in consideration from the movement of the Old Testament to the New and not bringing the new into the old, then his methodology makes so much more sense of why Jesus even brought this up and why, in some sense, he could be seen as the actual Lord of the council, especially in the way that he references it in the verses in John 10. And so, anyways, I would encourage folks to definitely at least read that. And if you are more daring, you can Google search for Mike's paper and it's available. He presented it at SBL, I believe. Yep. And it's a great piece of work. And I really wish more people were aware of it. But I think the human view is the safer and this less scary version of dealing with
it's always less scary.
John 10.
Good point. All right, number 3 for today. Do souls sleep before the resurrection? This is a good question. Again, notice how they're thinking. If we are to read the Bible left to right, it seems we would need to believe, as early Israelites did, that the soul is not conscious after death. Yet, numerous stories in the Bible show people living after their death. What does the Bible teach on the state of the soul after death? To ask the question again is to be thinking ahead of the teacher, because here's what, again, and I've done this in classes that I've taught over the years in my Bible college experience. Mm-hmm. Quick answer is the Old Testament Jews did not hold a single uniform view of the human's soul's fate after death. This is one of the things that the Bible, in other words, doesn't set the human race down and teach us what's going on. It just, you get these snippets of ideas coming through Job and Psalms and so forth. But several themes and developments can be traced through the Hebrew Bible and into later Second Temple Judaism. So here's the point. As you follow the canonical Bible through and then trace that into Second Temple period, 1st and 2nd century AD even, you have Jewish thinking that has a trajectory to it. It has movement to it, and not all thought is unified on this. This is just standard, even critical liberal thinking is that, and I'd recommend conservatives should do the same. There's no reason not to think this way, that you have some themes of the Bible that are never just plainly stated. You have them just kind of filling in poetic gaps of the text. You have it, events, narratives like, Samuel showing up in the Witch of Endor story, those kind of things. So, quick overview would be what I would call the early view, which would be Psalms and Job and such, where you just have people talking about what it's like to die. The sense is there's Sheol, that's the Hebrew word Sheol, which just means pit, cavern, mm-hmm. and it's a personified place of all dead people. It's where everyone goes, good and bad, king and pauper. It's boring, it's musty, it's not hell. It's just a place for the souls of the dead. It's not invented by God. God didn't invent Sheol and teach us about it. It's a human cultural way of other languages as well and other people groups defining what happens after death. It's really unknown. Yeah. It's a place of mystery, not happy by any means, but not also hell. So that's the earliest view of the Old Testament. Yeah.
It's also strangely a very almost near universal human concept of an underworld, totally. Right? Of people wonder, where did my uncle go? Where did my friend go? Where did my wife go? And I think just like that concept of they went, we did put the body in the ground.
In the ground.
So It seems like it's a good metaphor to say, your loved one is in the place of the dead or the underworld. Like literally, it's under our feet. It's under it's under the ground because it's
one of the earliest ways we study religion in a cultural sense, anthropological sense, is simply look at burial practices, funerary practices, and realize what they buried people with and what they were wearing and inscriptions and things like that are part of the funerary habit of the early people, whether it be Jew or Gentile, doesn't matter. We all kind of see the same thing happening where people, presumed in some sense that there's some kind of afterlife, but it's very shadowy. They weren't sure about it. Even today, if my dad is buried in a suit and tie. Well, if you were to dig him up without knowing, what would you think the 1986 people believed about the afterlife? You'd say, well, they thought he had to be dressed for a dinner based on how he's dressed. Well, no, we did that out of respect, and yet that's a case. Same problem with funerary, depictions of things. Do we know what the Egyptians believed just because they mummified remains? Well, we're not sure, but we think they believed in an afterlife that was again very mysterious. That's the early view of almost all cultures and civilizations, including Israel, including David, including Moses. That's my gut feeling on that. Then you have a later, again, trajectory where you hear this in the Psalms, even in the same book of, where we're all going to Sheol. Then you also hear, but you won't leave me there. There will be, my hope is that I will not stay there. And so there does become, and it's very general, I'm not going to list all the verses here, but you have this hope of or a hint of hope beyond death, that something will be there for us to look forward to. We're not sure. It is interesting that of all the things the Bible talks about, what happens when you die is a very quiet subject compared to everything else. So that comes through the Old Testament. It even comes into Second Temple Judaism. And here's my third point and last point. By the time you come to the pseudepigraphical books and Jubilees and things like this, and then the New Testament era of the Second Temple period, there is a sense, and this is part of the trajectory, of a conscious reward versus punishment feel. So that now to live a life that is given to evil, you better be presuming you're going to have a bad afterlife because of what you've done. That seems to be, again, a trajectory that's beyond Israel, even around the world. And so you see that even in biblical examples. So here's where that questioner, I think, is going with is, what about Samuel's appearance to the witch? I mean, you got to admit that's a weird one. Let me just read what I have here. Deuteronomy 18 and Leviticus 19 and 20 explicitly ban necromancy and consulting the dead. I find it interesting that preceding the Samuel story, for Samuel, 27-ish, 30-ish, somewhere in there, preceding that is a very clear don't do this rule in Torah. The implication is that the dead do exist in a post-mortem state that can be disturbed, but Yahweh strictly prohibits the living from crossing that line. So I think the Bible teaches kind of as a subtopic, obviously a subtopic at least, but maybe even a subtopic, is that the dead are real. The dead are in some sense available. They're under Yahweh's authority. And it's not a world into which you want to delve. You leave that world alone. You may appreciate your past ancestors and such, but you don't worship them. You don't bring them back. And even for what, King Saul did there with the Witch of Endor, clearly is a abrogation of this, don't do it issue coming out of Torah. He was not supposed to do this. The witch, I think, is surprised by what happens. And you probably get a real visitation of some kind with Samuel's spirit, and on you go from there. But all to say, do souls sleep? I don't have an answer for the listener that's categorical. I think the Bible is very quiet on this. My theory, my current personal theory, and I get this out of having a colonoscopy and losing 30 minutes of my soul last year, is that upon death, when I wake up after my death, it's going to feel instantaneous. It's going to be bam, that I go from life to life to death to life. It's just that's just the way souls work, and so that I will awake under God's rule in the next world immediately. It'll feel like as though immediately after I die. However that works, that's just my personal thought. But good question. I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, I mean, I will give my own personal take on it too. Like, in Gordon, one of my theology courses, we had to write up essentially what do each of us individually believe, right? So our professor can kind of see that we've been processing through all the theology lessons and so where do we land on these kind of questions? And so I personally landed that I don't think soul sleep, at least in the way that's a lot of folks these days try to make it out. I think there is an intermediate state. Now, whether that intermediate state is really conscious of time, that I don't know. I would probably argue against that. I don't think it is really conscious of time because time is so connected to our physical embodiment. Right. There's something very interesting. We're in this interesting kind of holding pattern, I would gather. But I think Mike was close to this too, where he talked about where Paul mentioned once one passes, you're in the presence of the Lord. And what does that mean? He doesn't go into it.
No, it's just, what does it mean? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, but it's there. The moment about Samuel wondering, what are you doing? Why, Saul, why are you doing this? like that implies to me that there is some sort of consciousness after we pass away, but I don't know if that implies that we're actually really aware of like thousands and thousands of years passing by. That would just drive a normal human being crazy.
Exactly. Yeah, poor Adam. He's had to live through this whole thing with.
It's still
Abel,
not done.
Abel, poor Abel. He's a teenager. He gets killed, and he has to live 4,000. Well, how old do you want Abel to be? But yeah.
So that's why I would caution, right? I don't think it's like a complete shut case of like, oh, we're completely unconscious. Like, I'm not sure about that, but I also am not completely convinced that we are aware of time in the way that we think of time now.
Exactly.
And
so Jesus could say, today you'll be with me in paradise. And that doesn't settle the question, are you going to be conscious for 2,000 years waiting? Yeah. It might mean the next thing you know, you're going to be alive and well. Well, that could be, again, like my colonoscopy, I woke up immediately after I went to sleep. As far as I knew, it was immediate. It wasn't like sleep. It was immediate. And that was the weirdest feeling I've ever had. I looked at the doctor and I said, where did you take my soul? I didn't experience anything for half an hour. It was not there, so that's different from sleep. That's why I don't like the word sleep. But consciousness is a question.
Well, you went with the colonoscopy. I'm like I guess the where I'm talking about, I'm not sure about if we'll be aware of time during this weird intermediate state, because I was thinking of when I had my wisdom teeth extracted and they didn't put me under it. Instead, they gave me this.
Oh, you're in that weird thing.
That gas that essentially like time did not really exist. Like I could hear things, like them cutting up the wisdom teeth into pieces to take out. And yet I also was not disturbed. It was a strange, weird
I've never had
moment.
That feeling. So that'd be another symbol.
So like that. So I guess that's probably also what's informing my background of like,
Okay, laughing gas view. Yeah, we have to add that to our views of the afterlife. Interesting.
It's a jolly time.
All to say we don't know, and I'm responding to Bill Maher here, one of his podcasts, which I enjoy. He's an atheist, but he's fair and honest on a lot of questions, and including, I like this one. He says the Bible's weird. Why do you guys believe it? He was talking to Mark Wahlberg, I think, a Catholic.
Yeah,
and I wish I could say this to Bill Maher because I think it would solve a lot of his frustration. The Bible's weird because it was written in a weird culture. That's why you got some weird stuff in there. It's not that God is weird. God is dealing with a culture that he's talking to people within that culture. And of course, you're going to have slavery and polygamy and military things going on, the wars of David and stuff like that are pretty bizarre. But it's in that culture that everyone else is doing it too. So why am I getting into this? Bill Maher, basically accused, in a nice way, Mark Wahlberg of only being a Christian, a Catholic, because he feared hell. Well, I come away from that kind of interview saying to myself, do I only love Jesus because I want to go to heaven? And no, I'm okay physically. I'm mentally okay with the idea that whatever God gives me in my afterlife is up to him. I'm okay with just giving it to him. Now, there are wonderful promises in Scripture that I enjoy and I hang on to about the afterlife, but that's not why I'm a Christian either. So I think a good response to, hey, you're only a believer because you don't want to go to hell, I think our answer can be, no, I'm a believer because it's true. There's one creator. He made me. I owe him my life. That's why, that story to me is valuable. But what happens after death, I think, is purposely kept pretty quiet in Scripture for reasons that God only knows, but I don't see a lot there to work with. Can I go on to this one? This is hard because I don't know much about Hinduism, so I'm going to just give you my quick answer. I am curious how a DCW interprets numerous Hindu beliefs concerning their deities. Brahma being the creator, Vishnu being the preserver, Shiva being the destroyer, Devi being a goddess. These are all things that the listener wrote in, so I'm just presuming this is true. And how they, the Hindus, operate within their divine hierarchy. Can Hindu polytheism be interpreted within monotheism? The only way to talk about another religion is to be a member of that religion. I think fairly, again, if I'm going to talk to an atheist, I want a real atheist. I don't want someone who plays the atheism role. If I want to understand Hinduism, I almost have to become Hindu to understand being in the family, going down that road, a certain path to understand Hinduism, shall I say. So I only know Hinduism from what I read. We did have, I think I might have told you this story. Stop me if I did. We had a Hindu. My boss said on one of our meetings, we're having a person coming in from India who, one of our trainers, and for a week from India, can any of you on our team take her home for a dinner? She would love to, meet Americans and be part of that. And I volunteered. Did I tell you that story?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. So quick rendition here. I pick her up at the airport, bring her home. And I'm praying the whole time, Lord, help me and Susan to be a witness to this lady, wonderfully educated, smart, thoroughly Hindu woman. And so we get talking, and God was good in the providential just flow of conversation, how her home looked compared to how our home looked when it came to God's. And she talked about the idols in the kitchen and how they would feed that idol every morning after breakfast, and then they would throw that food away at the end of the day and give it or her or whatever new food the next day. Very fascinating, very clearly, worshiping other gods. And so that's my that's my feel, what it was like to be Hindu. It's all in a conversation. So here's where I would say what I would respond with is this. I agree with the Hindu that there are real spiritual beings behind the nations. I think that's where we would agree. And DCW begins with this belief. And we all know this now that, Yahweh disinherited the nations, as it were, assigned them to created Elohim. These are real beings. Their job is to administer, like a senator, a governor, foreign lands, as it were. So a DCW interpreter would say that Hinduism's pantheon could reflect that same spiritual concept of God's being in charge of various parts of even your home. And well, now this gets very, granular, but down to your vestibule and your kitchen and your living room and all that. Here's where we differ, though. Yahweh alone is the uncreated creator. Here's where me and that woman differed. Is Yahweh the God over all gods, or is he not? Or Jesus and, that role of being the Son of God. So while the DCW accepts the reality of all these beings, and I would say Hinduism included, it insists that Yahweh alone is uncreated and thus the creator of all these other beings. So that gets into that discussion, where we would then make a critique, and it would be where I would, and I didn't do this, but where I could actually challenge the Hindu to a point of, you need to believe this or you're in danger. That would be misplaced worship. And so, and here's where I agree with Matthew Bates, I think you do too, that salvation in a DCW model works as a loyal allegiance to Yahweh through Jesus. The worship of other gods is disloyalty, and you'd name it that way and say, and you want to say this in a kind way to a woman who's sitting at your dinner table, right? She's been invited into my home, so I have every reason to be kind to her, but I would say, here's what the Bible would claim. You are being disloyal to your Creator if you continue to worship these beings that Paul would call in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 20, demons. So that's where I would go. And then the mission, if you want to think about it in a broad term, when it comes to Hinduism, you want to bring Hindus into the family. This sounds weird to the modern evangelical, but here we go again. What's the point of the DCW? You want to bring Hindus into the family of Abraham, this is Galatians 4. You want to bring all the nations back into the family. Who is the head of that family? Abraham. Why is he the head of that family? He is the worshiper of Yahweh. So, in other words, I wouldn't go after sin management. I wouldn't ask that woman to repent of her sins. That's not the point of the gospel to a Hindu. They need to straighten up their worship patterns through Jesus, through Christ, and talk about conversion from one God to another as the final result. So that's my understanding of Hinduism. I am not a Hindu, so I don't know how it works. I have to agree.
I would recommend the folks, I guess, because I'm not as familiar with it as well. My lead pastor is actually probably more familiar with it because he's gone down to the denomination that our church is a part of works with a relief organization that empowers especially Indian and Indian women, widows, to actually start their own entrepreneurial businesses to take care of themselves, their family, their villages. And so he's seen uphand how the caste system within Hinduism has affected society on a larger scale. And so he has more to say about that. What I would recommend, though, is that there was a guest that Mike had on his podcast years ago, Gerald McDermott, who wrote a book called God's Rivals.
Yep.
Why has God allowed different religions?
Yeah.
Insights from the Bible and the early church. And again, this is one of the reasons I do think the early church does have something to teach us, not canonically, not authoritatively, but they do provide insights into practical wisdom in practice of how do we interact with people who are coming from faiths where they are worshiping many, many other gods that we acknowledge that that's a spiritual reality. But how does that interface with Jesus as Lord? Yeah. And so it's a great book. I would really kind of recommend it because it's good insight into how did the early church deal with that kind of interesting conundrum of a missionary encountering the world of Hinduism, for example. How would a missionary interact with that kind of spiritual, I guess, air that the person found themselves in?
A good example, again, of a Unseen Realm book that Mike used to write Unseen Realm. In other words, Gerald McDermott is saying things that Mike said, hey, this fits. This is exactly where I'm going with my my understanding of Deuteronomy 32 worldview. So, yeah, good book. Yeah. Last question, and this kind of deals with our John 6 discussion. So kind of on top of it, we're heading back into our John study next time. It's an interesting question. Some Greco-Roman mystery religions of the first century, is it Bacchus and Dionysus? I'm not a historian.
There's a lot of wine.
Yeah, a lot of wine. In fact, she's the god of wine, I believe.
Yep.
They included symbolic or mythic cannibalism motifs. Oh, yeah. In fact, our listener even mentioned Dionysus right here. So there is that idea in the first century world of, especially among their mystery religions, of a cannibalism idea. Not that it's part of the religion, but it is kind of the theme of some of the liturgies that they would talk about. Which, here's the point, which were probably known to Jesus' audience. Okay, so here's the question. Why did Jesus use eating flesh language which was abhorrent to the Jew? And he doesn't do, if you remember our study back in our podcast, he doesn't do it just once in John 6. He keeps pounding away. Eat my flesh, drink my blood. I mean, it's pretty standard. In fact, here, if a person's watching us, I'm going to throw the slides back up from that study where I went in. This is from when I was preaching through John in my church, and I just took a day. I remember going to a coffee shop and just reading the whole book of John, looking for this question: what are we supposed to do with Jesus or for Jesus in John's gospel? And it was a fun day, and the list starts getting repetitive. A lot of believing in Jesus, come to Jesus. And by the time you get to then in 6, verses 53 to 56, you get eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood no less than 6 times, maybe 7, 8 times. Yeah, it depends on where you stop reading. But in John 6, it's very clear that you're supposed to eat his flesh and drink his blood. And as you continue through the rest of the book, you again return to themes like believing, hearing, following, worshiping, loving Jesus. Again, you can really expand the list into pretty common sense ideas. And the point is this, that when you go back, my recommendation is when you go back to John 6 and read it in light of the rest of the book, you understand him to be speaking metaphorically, symbolically. And in fact, that's exactly what eating flesh is meant to do to the audience, to stun them into saying, whoa, that part about eating, can you go back to that? That sounds so bizarre to us because we are abhorrent to that. We don't eat pigs. We don't eat, of course, humans. Why would you talk in those terms? So I think my personal answer is he did it to stun the crowd. That's not unlike Jesus. He often will do this, give a parabolic, proverbial witticism to answer an otherwise straightforward question. I think he does that too in the Eastern mind. Not confused, but to clarify and to make people wander off into their own homes and villages, wondering about what he said. So Jesus is the master teacher on that level, that he will say things that stun them. It comes into our text as bizarre. It would have met the first century ear with, I wonder why he said that. I think he said it to mean this is what it means to follow, believe, abide. You so engross yourself with this person that it's akin to eating them. Perish the thought. But that's the picture of what it means to abide in Jesus, to follow him, to know him, to desire to do his will. So that's my quick answer. I think he did it purposely to stun the crowd, but that's not unlike Jesus.
Ron, can I share what I have on my screen?
Sure. I'll stop sharing. And I think you're available to do so.
Okay, let me see if I can share. Because folks don't realize, throughout our recordings and podcasts, I have my Logos open, and sometimes I'm quietly typing out something to see, just like doing a little kind of background research and just some thoughts and stuff like that. That's why I'll say things like here's this entry from BDAG. So Logos has this little great feature of having an LLM or an AI. And so I had it go through my own library and I asked a similar question. Why does Jesus say, eat my flesh, in a cultural world that had religions that admonished their believers to eat their God's flesh and blood?
Well said. Right? The prompt is very important when it comes to AI. Yeah, you want to be very careful.
And so here's the synopsis it gave out. Jesus' statement about eating his flesh and drinking his blood was deeply rooted in the cultural and religious context of ancient sacrificial practices. To those who first heard it, this language was familiar and normal, particularly to people accustomed to ancient sacrifice rituals. In these practices, when people offered an animal sacrifice, they believed that after the flesh was offered to the god, the deity had entered into it. By eating the sacrificial meat, worshippers believed they were literally consuming their god and becoming God-filled, experiencing what they perceived as the dynamic vitality of their deity. And you can, folks who are looking at the video version of this, they can read on, and it actually points out where is it drawing its sources, its materials from, the research that was in my library. Cool. But it is an interesting kind of concept. Is it possible? Yes, like what you were saying, Ron, about how Jesus is saying this, one, to shock his audience. But I also now wonder, was it also to get people to, he's taking advantage of something that maybe the Gentiles, the pagan worshipers, were understanding in some sense of, you want to take in the life of God. You want to take in the life of the Creator. Our lives with his life is the ideal, to combine together with the Creator. But he's not saying literally eat my flesh. No, you get this. Culturally, you see this with your pagan neighbors. Yeah. They're not thinking.
Well, what you're saying is interesting, that the Gentile in the back of the audience would have been shaking his head yeah, okay, I see what you're doing. And the Jew would have been shaking it the other direction. But he was playing off what one people group would not have found offensive because of the theology behind it. And the other one would have found offensive. So maybe it's parabolically drawing both audiences in.
And in a way can actually draw them together, right? Because for the Jewish Christian who is hearing this, I am so confused. I have no idea where this is even coming from. Mm-hmm. But from the Gentile Christian, it's well, this is how we used to do it when I used to worship Zeus. And that can inform, and it's so the message in the end is still join with God's family, participate in God's life, be vitalized by his spirit. Yes, so that both Jew and Gentile Christians can be unified in that. So anyways, I just thought that was a really kind of cool little thing of Jesus was using some sort of technique that, yes, shocked a lot of his Jewish audience. But for the Gentiles later, they're this sounds oddly familiar.
That's That's what I just did last week. Yeah. There is, to me, one of the studies, again, that I want to pursue, but I know it's a bottomless well, is how Gentile was Galilee in the Second Temple era. So that with Jesus growing up in Nazareth and wandering about Capernaum and those north of the Sea of Galilee area, now it is a route traveled by Gentiles as they work from anywhere in the Asia area down to Egypt. You've got to go right across the top of the Sea of Galilee. So we know that the travel patterns of the entire Asiatic world would have passed within a few miles of Nazareth. The question then becomes, how Gentile was Jesus' audience at the Beatitudes, for example? Because he would have been standing in a place, if it's anywhere close to where we think it is, where you can stand there and you can see the ancient road go by. So the idea that, here's what I'm getting away from, is that when we read Jesus, we have to always think of Pharisees and Sadducees being his main audience. I think you can have the average Galilean there who likely, if not Hellenistic in his bloodline, he was at least Hellenistic in his thought patterns, because he saw this stuff all the time. And so even when you go today to Chorazin, the city, and it's got this black basalt temple, small, of course, but it's a temple that's probably 2nd, 3rd century. But it has a Medusa head, there. That every indication is that here's a temple in Galilee dedicated to a Greek pantheon, which is bizarre to think of. But now you have to kind of think backwards. How close to the days of Jesus could it have been that you could have gone into a synagogue? I'm sorry, it was a synagogue, not a temple. And this synagogue could be dedicated to the worship of not Yahweh, but other beings in the Greek and Roman pantheon. It makes you wonder, at least, now that when we hear Jesus talking about eating and drinking, now you bring up a good point. Maybe half his audience said, yeah, we do it all the time.
And I think also, to kind of explore what you were just even saying about how Gentile or Hellenized the folks were, I think one common misperception that folks have, because sometimes I see this in our Facebook group and whatever else, of we need to return back to the Hebraic line of thinking, right? And a part of me is sort of do you not realize that during the Second Temple period and Jesus's day, it really was actually a question of how are you reacting to Hellenistic culture? How Greek were you? Are you a little Greekish or are you really Greekish? Because amongst the Jewish community, you had folks who could only speak and read in Greek. They couldn't read Hebrew. You had other folks who were just so ashamed of even being Jewish that they went through efforts of even trying to go uncircumcised themselves, to actually have some sort of procedure done to them where they are no longer circumcised. And I'll just leave that for people to try to figure out how did they do that. But it's in the records. My professors pointed it out, and we were just like, what? But everyone was reacting to Hellenization to one degree or the other. Even those who were against Gentiles and wanting to kill every one of them in Israel, it was a reaction against Hellenization. Everyone had some sort of opinion and influenced by it, no matter what. And in our modern day, I can go to almost pretty much any country in Europe, any country even in Asia, and I'm pretty sure someone will know at least a little English. And so in some ways, we even see a glimpse of that, of just how pervasive Hellenistic culture became. And so I think we have to kind of get past this whole entire we need to be more Hebraic in our thinking versus being more, Hellenistic. The reality is it was a mixed concoction that you can't easily separate. It was basically vinegar and oil mixed together to make your vinaigrette. Are you going to sit through the time to separate those out or just acknowledge this is tasty?
Yeah. Good point. I like your point in that we don't want to go back to the Bible so far that we lose sight of where Jesus himself stood and what world he was dealing with. So now that you bring it up as we close, before we talk again, I'm going to be taking my wife and her sister and brother-in-law, who was my college roommate, We're us four are going on a cruise to celebrate our 40th anniversary and their 35th anniversary. And we're going to go around the Greek Isles. So by the time I come back next time together, I'll tell you how it went. But it'll be 2 days in Paris, 2 days in Rome, then a cruise around the bottom of Italy and up into Ephesus and Istanbul. So I'm an experienced, first time I've ever been in that part of the world. Kind of what you're saying there about being able to go anywhere in a little bit of English. I'll see how that works in Rome and Paris and so forth. But what I'm going for, besides celebrating 40th anniversary and just the time away, will be theologically again to just feel what it's like to be part of a world that Jesus is in charge of, but people, again, who I've never met, never will see again, who are worshiping in ways that probably don't mirror mine, but how it aligns with the gospel or doesn't. And whether I be in the Vatican, we're going to visit the Vatican. How does it feel to be in that place when it comes to the spiritual sense of what it's about? And that kind of question is just going to be on my mind. But anyway, that's where I'll be in the next week here. So,
congratulations!
Anything else we can close up before our time? Otherwise, best wishes on your as we come into the latter months of 2025 and the holiday season and all that. I hope you have wonderful time with family and friends going forward. So,
you too, Ron.
Let's cut it quits for now. And to everyone, thank you again for being part of this. And if you have questions, it's questions.dcwp@gmail.com. Please keep them coming. We love taking them and spending our time thinking about them. Until we talk again, have a blessed week. Thank you.